Welcome everyone. I'm Amy Daniels, Project Manager for Spark. Today we are privileged to have Dr. Mary McDonald with us speaking about the ever-important topic of transitioning and effectively preparing individuals with ASD. Dr. McDonald has 25 years experience directing programs for people with autism from early intervention through adulthood. She is an associate professor in the Department of Specialized Education at Hofstra University in New York and directs the advanced certificate programs, including the Advanced Certificate in Applied Behavior Analysis. Dr. McDonald is also serving as the Interim Associate Executive Director of Long Island Programs for Eden 2 Genesis. Eden 2 is a nonprofit organization that supports people with autism throughout their lives to achieve their full potential through service, science, and passion. Dr. McDonald completed her Ph.D. in Learning Theory at CUNY Graduate Center and is board certified behavior analyst doctoral level and a licensed behavior analyst in New York State. She has published articles in the areas of self-management, social reciprocity, fads in autism intervention, and schedules to promote cooperation of vocational skills. It is our extreme pleasure to have Dr. McDonald with us today, so without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm just thrilled to be here today speaking on behalf of Spark. I absolutely appreciate the organization's commitment to science and to research in autism, so I'm happy to be a part of it here today. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Our topic for today is adulting, effectively preparing individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And we are going to talk about the transition process and the importance of things like starting early. So you'll see as the presentation unfolds some of the different themes that we'll be talking about today. So what happens to our sweet little kids? You know, we have these young children with autism, and what happens? Well, what happens is they grow up. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the fact that we start out with these young children with autism and that they grow up, and that there are a lot of things that we need to focus on as they're growing up. And what we find a lot in the field, and I've been working in the field for a long time, is that very often it seems that they grow up overnight. And it just happens so quickly, and a lot of times parents feel very overwhelmed as they reach adolescence and start to move into adulthood. And sometimes I see families where their children have become adults, and they're at that point where they are actually adults now, and they realize that so much time has passed, and there's so many things that they still need to work on. So that's part of the impetus for today, is to really talk about that and have some time to think about that and what the important areas are that we might want to think about along the way. So this term adulting, it seems to be sort of the new term going around out there that some of the younger people are talking about, and they use this term adulting, and what they mean is basically to become an adult, to do grown-up things, to hold responsibilities, things like a 9-to-5 job that people typically think of very often when they think about moving into adulthood. Starting to pay a mortgage, not that any of us want to do that, but that's something that we do sometimes when we become adults, or we rent. We have a car payment, you know, anything that makes people think of what it might be to be sort of a grown-up, right, taking on those adult-like responsibilities. So we see that this younger population has sort of come up with this term of adulting, and they have some different ideas of what it might mean to be an adult or when they should move into some of these areas of adulthood. And it seems that the youngest group out there, sort of the millennials, as people are describing the younger groups, that sometimes they're saying that they feel that they might be moving into this adult area even at a later age than some people in some older generations may have. And to some extent, that might actually be a little bit of an advantage to our individuals with autism, because it may give us a little bit of time to work on some more of the things that we really do need to work on. But of course, it's going to be important for, you know, someone to be able to move into this world of adulthood. And we know that for many people with autism that it's a real challenge, and we're going to talk about what some of those challenges are here today. The need is very real. When we look at, again, sort of children, as we look at them when they are children, we see that the numbers are high. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, those numbers continue to increase. So right now, the numbers that we see are 1 in 68 children have autism. And of course, it varies if you look at certain states or if you look at boys versus girls and that sort of thing. But the general overall number is 1 in 68. And that number is, you know, a number that has increased very, very much so since I first started working in this field about 25 years ago. And we haven't really seen those numbers, you know, plateau or decrease yet. And so if that's the case, and we see that these numbers keep increasing, what that means for us is that means that we're already looking at these numbers increasing in these young children, so we have to realize that someday, yes, these children that we're working with will become adults. And so the adult population will also continue to become larger. And I'm sure many of you are aware, and I'm sure there's people participating here from all around, all different states, all different cities, and I'm sure that you all have your own experiences with what this might be like, but I am pretty sure that we probably could all agree that we don't necessarily have enough attention paid to transition, and we don't necessarily have enough or the level of services that we would often like to be able to have for adults out there with autism. And so if the numbers are increasing in our children, therefore the numbers will then continue to increase in our adults as well, and we need to be prepared for that, and there's definitely some concern about that. In terms of adults with autism, one of the areas that people tend to look at when they think about adulthood is this idea of employment. As I mentioned before, this idea of this sort of 9 to 5 type of job. And certainly we're not committed to having it be a 9 to 5 type of job for our students. We're very flexible, and we'd be very happy to have many different possibilities for the students, the individuals that we work with. But the bottom line is that what we see is that we see that a lot of people with autism are not actually getting those jobs. They're not really getting to the point where they're having gainful employment. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing a large percentage of individuals with autism who are actually either unemployed or underemployed, so not certainly employed enough, maybe working some part-time jobs or something a few hours a week or something to that extent. Now, I will tell you, and I'm sure some of you may have looked at some of the research out there, that the research does vary greatly in terms of the actual percentages that are reported in terms of employment in individuals with autism. So here we say about 90% of adults with autism are underemployed or unemployed, and that's a high number. And I'm going to show you on the next slide a graph that actually shows you a comparison of individuals with different disabilities. This was some research done in 2013 by Rokes, and they looked at individuals with intellectual disabilities and individuals with language disorders and individuals diagnosed with learning disabilities. And they looked at their full-time employment specifically between the ages of 21 and 25 years. And then they compared that same age range with individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And so what you can see here very clearly in this particular image is that the individuals with autism are much more underemployed than people who have these other disabilities that are listed here. And so again, I will tell you that if you look at various studies, you will see different numbers, and it can be a little bit confusing if you're trying to get information on this particular topic. So I would like to let you know that if you are looking for this information, what you have to look at is you have to look at the many variables, and that's why the data vary so greatly. So for example, this particular graph, and this is why I shared this with you, is specifically full-time employment, and it's specifically 21 to 25-year-olds. So those are two particular variables that would greatly affect the data that you would see here. So if they had looked at, for example, any employment, whether it's full-time or part-time, and if they had looked at a different age range or a wider, broader age range, then you might see something different in the data. And so it's a little bit confusing when you try to actually look at the data. But just wanted to share at least some pieces of it with you to get you sort of thinking along these lines, because no matter which set of data we look at, whether it's full-time employment for 21 to 25-year-olds, whether it's overall employment across the years, we're going to certainly see that individuals with autism probably are not necessarily employed as much as we would like to see. So there's many, many things for us to think about and sort of lots of work for us to do. So one of the areas that we can look at are some sort of essential skills. And what's interesting about this is that when we look at things like preschool and kindergarten and elementary school that you see there on the left of the slide, there tends to be a lot of research in these areas. And so if you go and you look at the research, you will see that people have looked to see, well, what's important for preschool, and they've published a lot of things about preschool children and all the different things that are important and many different interventions to teach these variety of skills. And what we see for kindergarten is very similar, and so there's been a lot of research on what are the important skills for a kindergarten student. And this is specific to individuals with autism as well. And what we see also is that elementary school is pretty well represented, probably the best represented in terms of research for individuals with autism. The majority of the intervention-based research that you'll look at will most often cover the age range of individuals in elementary school. So what we don't know, or what we need to know more about, is really about adolescents and adults. And so we definitely have some research out there that tells us about intervention and skills, but not nearly as much as we do for the younger individuals. And so it's definitely an area that we need to continue to research and learn more about. Some important skill areas. I love this image today. I can't adult today. Please don't make me adult. And I am sure that some of our individuals with autism feel that way, and I'm sure that some of us feel that way sometimes. But there are some important skill areas that we do need to focus on, and some of these we will talk about throughout this presentation today. It will come up again. But one particular area that's going to be certainly crucial, and I'm sure people have worked on this skill with individuals with autism that they work with, but that would be communication and social skills. So this is going to be such an important area for individuals with autism, for them to be able to communicate. Could be basic things like their wants and needs. Socializing could be very high-level socialization in terms of complex conversations, but it also could be very basic social skills, just in terms of, say, tolerating somebody, sitting at the lunch table while you're having a meal or something like that. Just being able to be in proximity of other individuals could be an example of social skills for an adult with autism. I mean, it's quite immense, and we'll talk about it a little bit later when we talk about social competence and some creative things that we've done and that some adult programs have done to try to work on social skills. Self-help and independent skills, always going to be important. So things like hygiene and banking and, interpersonal skills and so many different things that come up there. Self-help tends to be an area that many individuals with autism can have some difficulty with. And part of the reason for that sometimes is fine motor skills, depending on what the skill is. Some of it is actually just learning the skill to a level of complete independence. And then sometimes they have the skill, and it's just a matter of actually implementing the skill and understanding the importance of that skill and how that might sort of impact on others or how they might be seen by others. And so perspective taking comes into play there as well at times, that they may not realize how important it might be to engage in certain practices of hygiene and that sort of thing. Community awareness and community participation, we'll talk about that a little bit more today, but certainly having our individuals with autism at a young age, as early as possible, being out in the community and becoming aware, and having the community be aware of people with autism and really integrating into the community and truly being a part of the community and having the community understand how important people with autism are in their community. So we'll talk more about that. Self-advocacy is a whole huge area. We probably could certainly do a whole presentation on this and the other topics here today. But for many individuals with autism, they are not necessarily able to advocate for themselves. And so what we see is that we tend to be the person who tends to be advocating for the individual with autism more so. But we absolutely do have some individuals with autism who can self-advocate and who we can work on that skill with, and that's going to be important down the road. Job skills, as I mentioned before, the employment issue is certainly a real issue. And that's a very individual kind of decision. I certainly have some adults with autism that I work with who would like to have many, many jobs and transition from one job to another and kind of keep themselves always interested and excited. And I have some individuals who would like to not work at all. And I have some who would like to work, maybe a full-time 9-to-5 type of job. And so it's going to be very individualized, but the idea of really working on that job readiness and working towards potentially some sort of gainful employment, and always with the end goal being the quality of life, and that's what's going to be most important, of course. And then leisure skills. Leisure skills tend to be a really challenging area for many individuals with autism, they often when we go to job sites with the students that I work with here through Eden 2 programs in Genesis, they tend to prefer to do the work tasks than to actually take the breaks. And so leisure skills in and of itself really starts to become a big issue for many of the individuals, and we've had to be very creative, not only in teaching those leisure skills, but trying to make them actually really enjoyable so that the individuals with autism actually will choose to engage in those leisure skills, and then providing some visual supports and things to help them to make some choices about what those leisure skills might be, you know, when they're at a job site and they have that downtime. So one example is we have some individuals who will bring a knapsack with them to the job, and then in the knapsack they will have a few different activities. It could be Sudoku, it could be an iPad, it could be various things, and then they'll have a list of, you know, different kinds of activities that are leisure activities that they can choose from, and it helps them to be able to make that choice. And then they're able to go right to the backpack when they have that break time, make a choice, and then pull something out and engage with that activity. And that has been really, really helpful for many of the individuals who were really having a difficult time with this particular skill, to the point where other people on the jobs were feeling like, you know, they were sort of showing them up by working so hard, so they needed them to take a break. So I think it's always interesting that the individuals with autism that we work with want to work so hard in some cases that we actually have to sort of make them take a break, right? So this idea of independence is going to be crucial, and it's something that comes up a lot. It's a very popular word when we talk about people with autism. People are always saying, well, is he independent with that? Can he do that independently? Well, how independent is he? And this term independent comes up often. So what does it mean to be independent? You know, I believe that everybody on this call today here is an adult, and I believe that you probably, if I asked you, would consider yourself to be relatively independent. And the question is, you know, do you consider yourself to be independent, and why? Why do you consider yourself to be independent? What about you makes you independent? And so it's a question, because the truth is that it's not so simple. You know, the truth is that if I asked you that question, you might think, yes, I'm independent. But if you really started to think about it, you might realize that you're not as independent as you actually thought that you were. And we'll talk more about that and how that relates to individuals with autism, because we put a lot of pressure on our students when they are students and our adults when they become adults to be independent. As I said, this term comes up a lot. And the truth is that none of us are completely independent. So we'll talk more about that. These are particularly skills that were identified in teenagers, that were important skills that were shown through some research that these particular attributes would help somebody to become a well-functioning adult. So I specifically include this because I find these skills to be quite challenging and really not as sort of black and white as we like to sometimes see things for individuals with autism that we work with. And so you'll see as I go through how complex some of these skills can be. So the first is problem-solving skills. Many of the individuals that we work with have a really difficult time with problem solving, and it's not necessarily something that's in their repertoire per se. It doesn't mean that it's not something that we can teach, but it requires a whole curriculum and some real commitment to that area to be able to teach that. Critical thinking connected to the problem solving, obviously another area. Emotional intelligence, you know, beyond what most of the curriculums that people are using are really looking at these kinds of things. Values and ethics, resourcefulness, creative processing. Executive functioning, we certainly know that executive functioning is a real challenge for many of the individuals that we work with. And leadership, perspective, and being able to see the big picture and prioritizing. So these sound like really wonderful skills and nice attributes for someone to have as they're moving towards adulthood, but we also see that this could be a problem for some of the individuals that we work with. And so, you know, there's only so much time that we can work on skills, and trying to fit in all of the various skills that we're going to have to fit in is going to be challenging. That's why we need to start as early as we can, and I'm going to continue to promote that throughout this conversation, because I think that if we wait, which is unfortunately sometimes what happens, where people sort of wait until individuals with autism are at that transition age, which people consider to be, you know, somewhere around early adolescence, maybe around 14, 15, maybe 16 by law, that sort of thing, depending on where you are. But the truth is, if we wait that long, we've already lost a lot of valuable time. So we have to think about things maybe a little bit differently if we really want to be able to work on these many, many varied skills. And then something for us to think about and maybe just reflect on a little bit, because we certainly are players in this when it comes to promoting this independence in the individuals that we work with. And the question is, what role do we play in this? I know that we're trying to promote independence, and we might be using certain types of prompts and fading those prompts and doing all the things that we should be doing in that sense. But do we sometimes limit or prevent independence? Is there anything that we're doing that is actually limiting or preventing independence? I know that people who have children in general, absolutely, if they really thought about it and were reflective, they would admit that yes, in their children they sometimes do limit or prevent independence. There's no doubt that is true for most people. So the question is, when it comes to individuals with autism, is that true as well? And I would think that it probably is. I would think most people, if they really thought about it, would say yes. There are situations in which this is true. So I have parents that will tell me things like, well, I know he can tie his shoes, but I tie them for him because it's faster in the morning. I need to get him on the bus. Things like that. Just a simple little example of this. And you could take it through to many different kinds of examples across many different skill areas. So it is possible that we need to think about how we can really move along a continuum to promote independence, and that maybe we need to be very cautious about ways in which we might actually be limiting or preventing independence. And I think just being a little reflective of that as parents or as professionals, whoever may be interacting with somebody with autism. So things like one-to-one supervision, we do think about this sometimes from school into adult services, that very often in school programs students may get more one-to-one type of supervision, or sometimes even all day, and we want to move from that more towards independence. Now I know for our program here, we have students who do sometimes receive one-to-one supervision or one-to-one teaching in the school program, and then they move into our adult program. And in the adult program, the ratio is not one-to-one. It's very different. And most adult programs do not necessarily provide one-to-one staffing, so it is very different. And it becomes a real change for the individual with autism to go from one-to-one to then move into more of a group kind of scenario. And so it's important for us to think about that as early as we can and work towards that. Time on task and transitions, so being able to stay on task and being able to transition, both of those are important skills to promote independence. Personal care we mentioned. Behavior and self-monitoring, we will talk about behavior a little bit more towards the end, but specifically self-monitoring. If somebody does have some sort of behavior and they are able to self-monitor their own behavior, which we definitely have a bunch of students working on now, that certainly makes them more independent and much more self-aware in terms of their behavior. So that's definitely something that would be helpful to think about if it's sort of a possibility at this point for the individual or your child. Leisure skills we mentioned already, and vocational preference and choice we will talk more about, certainly always going to be important. So I had asked earlier if you thought that you were independent or how independent you were. So the truth is that many of us might have answered that question very quickly and said, yes, I'm independent. And the truth is that there's actually independence and there's interdependence. And I think that this is important to think about. If somebody is able to do something completely and totally by themselves, then we can say that they did that independently. But if they are doing something and there is some interaction with others in their environment involved in it, then we can really think of that as interdependence. So not only are we probably quite interdependent in our own lives, but really in some ways we need to be interdependent, and actually being interdependent in a lot of situations is probably actually more valuable in a social way, if you think about it, than just being independent. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. The importance of interdependence, also comes into play specifically when it comes to vocational skills. So I just listed a few ideas here for us to think about today. There's many, many more I'm sure that you can come up with, but I just wanted to get us thinking a little bit. So when somebody is volunteering in the community or at a job site or something like that, the fact that they could ask for help with something or ask for clarification of an instruction that was provided with a task, or ask for something that's missing, or ask for feedback from their supervisor. All those kinds of things are going to be crucial, really, at a job site. I mean, imagine going to a job and just working in a silo and completely working independently and never interacting with anyone ever in any way. There may be some jobs out there like that, but there are less of them. And so having some of these kinds of interdependence types of skills would really be pretty important to be more successful in the job. And then, of course, we have situations where sometimes we want the individuals that we work with to ask for help, and sometimes we want them to do something more independently. What we find sometimes is that when we teach individuals with autism to engage in something like asking for help, they tend to sometimes over-ask then for help. So they might ask for help, continuously, every single time, whether they need help or not. And so this is a quick little visual prompt that we used for some students in the past. And so the green, it's a little hard to see, but the green says I need help, and the red says work alone. And so we were actually teaching them to discriminate between when they should be asking for help and when they should be working alone, just to be able to help them to understand that there might be times that you could actually work alone if they already had all the skills versus if it was something that they actually needed help with. There are some very specific guiding principles that have been put out to help us to think about working with adults with autism. And so the National Alliance for Direct Service Professionals has a code of ethics specifically for adult services. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because we don't really have as much time as we could probably spend on this topic here today, but I'm just going to kind of mention them, and it's certainly something that you can all look back at, but I thought it would be nice for you to have it. So the first is the fact that our support should be person-centered. So everything should always start with the individual that we're working with, and then branch out from there. We shouldn't be working on goals because we choose them, but of course because it's most important for that individual. Of course, always promoting physical and emotional well-being, always going to be at the forefront of everything that we do. Integrity and responsibility, so assisting people in leading self-directed lives, really making sure that we are putting them first and putting their lives first and working with them, not sort of running things for them, as sometimes may seem. Confidentiality, always going to be important to respect confidentiality. Justice, fairness, and equity. So just making sure that we are being just and fair and equitable for the individuals that we serve. And providing respect and dignity to the individuals and to their uniqueness, and really seeing them for all of the wonderful value and everything that they add to our community. Relationships, helping them to make and maintain relationships. And of course, as we mentioned, social skills are really challenging. And so this can be an area that is sometimes difficult. And I think that we just have to sometimes be a little bit more creative about how we might help to do some of that. Self-determination, helping people to direct that sort of course of their life. And again, helping them to be the person who sort of determines what their life should be like. And sometimes we find that to be a little challenging because within the constraints of some of the service provision out there, we don't always feel that it's always possible for them to always be doing what it is that they'd like to be doing. And so I know here in New York we have adult programs in the form of Day-Hab and a variety of other related kinds of programs. And then we also provide some self-determination based services, and some of those services allow for a little bit more of the self-directed kinds of options. And advocacy, I had mentioned a little bit earlier, but advocating, for individuals in these various, kinds of situations to be able to be in the community and, in all of the ways in which we can promote their rights. So there are some ethical principles that also relate to working with individuals with autism, really in any way that we might be working to sort of change behavior. And if you're not familiar with this article and you have an interest, I put a little image up here for you so that you can take a look at it after the webinar. It might be something you might want to take a look at. It's considered to be a classic article for individuals working in the field. And so people are usually taught this article at some point, in their coursework probably. But it goes into a much more depth, but I just wanted to share it with you today just, as a point to bring up, and that's something that you might want to look more into. But it talks about things like, what does the individual have the right to, things like a therapeutic environment, programs that teach functional skills, which we will talk about more, behavioral assessments, and making sure that the treatment procedures are going to be the most effective treatment procedures available. This was an article that was written in 1988, which is becoming dated at this point, but to be honest, the content of the article is, still very, very pertinent to our discussion and certainly to working with individuals with autism. So what are some of the issues that we're facing at this point when we're thinking about this, working our way towards adulthood? Part of the issue I mentioned is this idea that people are sort of transitioning at 21, that they're just waiting too long to do it, so they're not really working a whole lot on the transitioning before that. Now, I would say that depending on the setting, you might see some variation in that. So if your child or your student, depending on where you're working, or if this is your child, is in a program that is more a specialized program, so there are people with autism or maybe related disabilities only in that program, they might focus on more of the functional skills and think more about transitioning earlier on. But what we see often is that many individuals with autism are participating in local school districts and public school, and there may be a lot more focus on the areas of academics and much less focus on some of the areas of things like communication and self-help and social skills and job skills and leisure skills and some of those kinds of things. So we tend to see that there just may not be enough of that happening, and if we wait until age 21, we certainly will have some difficulty at that point. Keep in mind that some of our best teaching will happen during the school years when we have the higher staffing ratios to be able to teach as well. And once we get to the adult world, a lot of that will not necessarily be as available. And so we really want to have as much, sort of foundation as we can by the time we get to the adult world. As I mentioned, the one-to-one instruction is not typically provided in adult programs, so it's something for us to think about. It's something that we're thinking about here in our program and better ways to sort of transition as the students are getting older and having them being able to be included more so in groups and really to be able to be productive, in a not one-to-one kind of situation and to be able to move more towards that. And staff turnover sometimes can be an issue in adult programs as well, and so that lends itself to possibly even more group structures within the program, and certainly can make it challenging for individuals who might have difficulty with a lot of change. And of course, you have to train new staff as they come in, and so all of those things can have an impact as well. So when we think about our school age programs and kind of moving towards our adult service programs, there are some differences clearly. One of the differences that we see is just in terms of the requirements of the staff. So in our school age programs, obviously for a classroom teacher, we would need to have not necessarily a master's level teacher, but most of them happen to be master's level teachers, but some sort of certified person in the role as a teacher, where in adult services that is not the case. Again, in school age programs, higher staffing ratios, and the instruction is more sort of intense and direct, to the students, and may happen one-to-one or in smaller groups. And we see those changes, when we move into the adult world. It is going to be lower staffing patterns. There's going to be more groups, and certainly the experiences will be much more community-based, as they should be. But we're going to have to prepare for that a little bit early on, because to sort of just step from one to the other would be like crossing the Grand Canyon for some individuals with autism. And so we have to find the steps along the way to take us from one area to the other. We can't sort of make that giant leap. Many goals to adult services, but generally speaking, of course, will relate to some of the vocational kinds of skills, and increasing independence as well are going to be some of the major areas that people will look at. Choice is going to be hugely important for for all people with autism, of course, but today kind of focusing on our adolescents to adults is going to be really important. And the truth is that there's good choices and bad choices. But if we don't teach people to make choices, then they'll never be able to make a good choice or a bad choice. This article that I have here by Bannerman, I also put up here in case you haven't seen this article before and you want to get this after the webinar. Excellent article to take a look at. Very interesting, talking about the balance, which is balancing our intervention with individuals with autism, specifically adults in particular, but also balancing their rights. So I love the title here, The Rights of People with Developmental Disabilities to Eat Too Many Donuts and Take a Nap. Because the truth is, you all could get off this webinar today, and you could choose to eat too many donuts and take a nap. And you could also choose to have 4 cups of coffee today. And sometimes for individuals with autism, they become adults and they don't feel that they have the same rights that other people have. And so this is an interesting article that tries to grapple with that kind of topic. So maybe something to look at. When we think about choice, one of the ways that we can try to assure that we are looking at choice is to do a preference assessment, and try to see what the individual would be happiest doing. And so if we're thinking about job skills, we could actually use this idea of preference and do a preference assessment related to some job skills. And we've done that with many of our individuals, and it can help. It's just that sometimes the types of assessments that are done are not necessarily getting at the heart of what you need to get to. And so sometimes an assessment is just a parent interview, and it doesn't help us to know what the individual with autism wants to do. It only helps us to know what the parent of the individual with autism thinks that maybe he wants to do, right, that sort of thing. And so we need to assess these things a little bit more directly. So I have some information here for you just in terms of thinking about preference assessment, some ways that you might do that. So that's there for you. I'm going to leave some of these things for you. I included the information so that you'd have it to look back upon. We've actually done some very specific direct choice assessments with students with autism, even while they were adolescents, to try to work on this at an earlier age. So we would give them a choice, like even something simple like, would you rather go on the computer or polish nails? And maybe the student chooses polish nails. And would you rather polish nails or clean the shelves? Polish nails. And we look to see like what comes up most often. But one of the things that we find is that we need some sort of an integrity check. Because if we just ask a verbal question like that, we don't know if the individual is necessarily always answering in the way that matches the response that they gave. They might just be saying the last thing that we said and that sort of thing. So of course we mix it up and we randomize it and all that, but we also have done some integrity checks. And so what we'll do is we'll ask which one they'd rather do, and then we'll have the material set up and we'll ask them to go do it. And we'll look to see if that matches. And that really helps to make sure that we're sort of getting the information that we need to get, right? Because as we're thinking about this transition, this sort of transfer from youth to adulthood, we just want to make sure that we're doing it in the best way possible. And we want to make sure that we're taking into account as best as we absolutely can truly the interests and preferences of the individuals that we work with. And one of the things that we see, I mentioned it earlier, is that for many students with autism, we're just not really focusing on the areas that are going to help us to get there later on. So what we're seeing is that the majority of what they're focusing on may be more academic-based and much less so on the life skills and social skills, which are really going to be the crucial skills, as we can see, for adulthood, because we're only in school for a certain amount of years. The rest of our life, we kind of live potentially sort of working and engaging in leisure, right? And those are going to be important things. Autism Speaks recently published something that might be helpful to people as well, so I included this. It's a transition toolkit, and it talks about some specific areas that you might want to look at in terms of addressing towards transition. It might be a nice tool and resource for some people. ISP is an individualized service plan, so these are some areas that we sometimes are targeting for the individuals that we work with. So again, I just provided some of these just as sort of ideas and jumping points for some people that may not have some of this information, just as examples of some of the different things that we might be doing. And of course, one of the important things is no matter what we're targeting, we always want to target these skills across all the different settings as best as we can. Because if we only target something in one room with one person, we know that for many of the individuals that we work with, generalization will become a real problem, and we won't really see those skills expressed. When we think about skills that we're working on, it's important to think about what these skills would look like sort of, for a resume, job specific. But then there are also skills that just kind of work across all the different environments. So I can teach a student to collate or sort, but teaching them to wait or problem solve or ask for help or ask for clarification are going to be more widespread types of goals that will work across many different kinds of job sites. So it might be important to just think about that. Excuse me. Of course, stay calm and teach, keep calm and stay cool. I think that, sometimes people can feel a little bit overwhelmed with how much needs to be done, and the truth is that we just need to just kind of move forward, and I think that that's the best thing that we can do. And always try to be thinking about the questions at the bottom of the slide here. Is what I'm teaching going to create independence? Is it functional? Will the individual use it? And is this something that is going to help them when they're adults? And so are there skills that we can think about that are lifelong kinds of skills that we could actually start at a really early age? I think that there are. And I think that if there's anybody here at the webinar today who's working with younger kids, I think it's great that you're here at this webinar, first of all. And maybe you can think about some of these things. But things like asking for help, the hygiene and bathroom kinds of skills, play turning into leisure, waiting, being able to tolerate no, like these are skills that are lifelong skills. And if we start working on those early on, that's one less thing. That's one less thing for us to have to think about, right, when we think about it later, because there's so many things for us to work on. This I love. This is by Preston Lewis. He talks about an example of, an individual with autism. He can put 100 pegs on the board in less than 10 minutes while in his seat with 95% accuracy, but he can't put quarters in a vending machine, right? So there's more examples here, but it's going to be important to work on those skills that are really going to be the skills that people are truly going to use every day. I have a whole list of functional curriculum resources here for you, so hopefully some of these might be helpful. So this is just here for your own reference, but a whole bunch of different materials. And then again, an example, going from something like addition and using a calculator and making it more functional, because that's something that we all do on our iPhones or Android phones these days. Looking at a student who was then adding with the number line, but now he adds with the calculator, was then sorting shapes, but now sorts silverware. But seeing a place where this can sort of move to and using these skills from a younger age to transition into some more functional kinds of skills at a later age. Visual supports are typically considered to be sort of the standard for many individuals with autism. Not all are visual learners, but many are. So I again just put a sampling in of some of the different kinds of visual supports that we use with some of our individuals. Just to give you some ideas of some of these. You'll certainly have access to this after, but I just wanted you to see what some of them might look like. Okay, we also have something called structured work systems, and it really is like a schedule-based system, and you can see from the image there that it shows you how something is laid out for the individual, and this is specific to some work or assembly different kinds of tasks that might be vocationally related, and it could be used at a job site as well, but it's something that could be taught prior and then carried over, which is nice. I'm not going to go through all the details because I do want to get through the rest of the slides, but this gives you a sort of a detailed little agenda here for how you might implement your structured work systems. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the community. So important to get out into the community. Really the bottom line is just to get out into the community. So I know that sometimes people tend to not go out into the community. They tend to hold back. And I think that the most important thing that you can do in whatever way you can is to start to get out into the community. If you need to have staffing, if you're the parent and you need to have staffing with you, absolutely. But in some way try to get out into the community will be important and as early as possible. You don't want to wait until your child's 21 and then all of a sudden they're going out into the community. So here's some of our students out in the community. You can see that they are either doing some like rec leisure or some vocational activities. And again, when you think about community, there's lots of different things that you can think about. They could be doing rec leisure. Here's one of our individuals who has autism. He is nonverbal and he runs marathons, like absolutely amazing, and comes in like first or second in the giant marathons. So he's doing amazing with his rec leisure skills. We have some individuals working in the community, and then we have some individuals doing a fitness class in the community. So anything we can do to get out there is certainly going to be important. We also have a lot of work and different kinds of job sampling that our individuals do, and we are in the process of starting a social enterprise that will get them out into a kiosk at the local mall, and they'll be producing some of the products that you see here, which is pretty exciting. And then we have some other things that they also do on and off site. In terms of behavior, just always, I don't think I can ever do a presentation without just mentioning it, but of course behavior is often going to be a roadblock, and I think that we just have to think when the students are younger, we have to find the absolute best way to prevent and replace those behaviors, because when they get older, it becomes so much more challenging. Communication is going to be one of the most important things that we could possibly do, as you could see here with the first then, I need a break. Having a student be able to access the break, asking for breaks, those kinds of things, whatever the example might be, depending on the function of the behavior, is going to be crucial, but really focusing on that. So I have some examples of some different systems that I included in here for you, just as some visuals for us. Okay, and the last thing here is the social competence, and clubs might be a good way for adults and adolescents to really start to socialize, and the reason for it is because it really looks at their personal interests. We're not just bringing them together to do a social group, but we're bringing them together in some way related around something that they enjoy. I have a gamers club that I work with, and the individuals with autism are amazing in it, and they talk more probably in the gamers club than they do anywhere else in their life. And why? Because they enjoy gaming so much. They are so motivated by it that when their parents see it, they cannot believe that their children are so verbal and so motivated to be verbal in that situation. And the truth is, it's because they are motivated. It's because they're so excited. So here, my last little image here is our little fish becoming independent. I hope that this is something that is a reality for the individuals that we work with. But again, I don't want that fish to land in that bowl and be all alone either, right? I want there to be some interdependence. So I think that it's always important to remember that piece as well. I hope that I was able to give you some information here today that will be helpful to you. I do have some resources in there, and I know that you have some questions. So I am going to stop talking and give us a minute to chat together.
Thank you so much, Mary. We got a few questions in, so I'm just going to read them aloud.
Sure.
So we had a question about the statistics that you showed in the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah.
Someone wanted to know if those were for only high-functioning autism and if that data was for a particular state or, a particular state.
Honestly, I don't remember, and I don't have it in front of me, but I will tell you that it's an excellent question, because those are the kinds of variables that I'm talking about when I was saying that every set of data or every article that you look at will have different data. And that's why it's actually really hard to share the data, and that's why I just put examples in, because the truth is there is no way to say this percentage of individuals are employed or this percent. It doesn't really work, because it's so dependent on the age and maybe the area, the state, even one research study looked at the particular programs that students came from and the type of intervention that they had, and that was a variable. So I don't know specifically, but I definitely could share that information after the fact if people were interested. But I think that those kinds of variables are so important to look at because they change the numbers every time. So unfortunately, we don't really have the clearest numbers right now.
Okay. Another question was, what kind of success do you see with young adults on the spectrum getting their driver's license?
Yeah, it's funny that you chose that question. I saw that one come up on the screen as I was presenting, and I said, oh, that's a really hard question. I would say that a lot of the individuals that we work with, unfortunately, are not at the level of being able to get their driver's license. But we absolutely have had some individuals who have accomplished that task. And then we've had some that have tried and have actually stopped trying because they were very overwhelmed by it. We've worked with a driving program that was very, I'm going to say, open to working with individuals with autism and really wanted to learn more about this and be able to be more educated in autism. So I think that what happens sometimes is if they're learning to drive and they're doing it through, say, the typical high school program, sometimes they might need something a little bit more and a little bit different. And so for some families, I've found that they've gone directly to driving schools where they found people who are sort of more willing to have the patience and have the persistence and be educated and sit with the parent and learn about that individual in order to make it be more successful. But I know an individual with autism who just got their driver's license about 2 weeks ago, so very exciting.
All right, thank you. Do you have any resources or organizations that you can refer people to for locating jobs or in regard to job skills?
That's interesting. I know that Autism Speaks was actually putting together some sort of a job type of directory, I believe. So that might be a good place to look. Other than that, there are a couple of, I'm going to say, sort of organizations or corporations out there that have been, I'm going to say, paying more attention to autism recently. So depending on the skills of the individual, for example, Microsoft is one. There is actually a computer company. I don't have the name in front of me, but there is a computer company that specifically is only hiring individuals with autism. So there are some tech, I'm going to say that's where a lot of it's happening. There are some tech-based companies that are specifically looking actually to hire individuals with autism. And Walgreens also has made a huge commitment specifically to autism as well. But in terms of like some sort of online, way to be able to access that, the only thing that I've heard of that's kind of broad would be through Autism Speaks.
Okay. Do you have any tips for teaching hygiene skills or managing hygiene in this period?
Yeah, so I think that that's, kind of twofold when it comes to the hygiene. I had mentioned the fact that for some individuals, it depends on where the breakdown is. So, is it that they're actually having difficulty specifically learning that skill and they're not able to engage in all the components of the skill? Or is it that they sort of have the skill, but they are kind of, what it seems to be, kind of choosing not to engage in that skill, right? So the first thing that I would do is, and I don't know, obviously, the person that asked the question, but maybe you have somebody involved with your child, if this is your child, like a behavior analyst or an educational consultant or somebody who has the ability to do an assessment and to really observe and see exactly what happens during these different hygiene rituals. And then look to see, is there a task analysis being used, because that's always going to be important. And can a task analysis be written and then used as part of the assessment to see where the breakdown is, to see if there are particular skills that actually appear to be lacking. And then if that is the case and there are specific skills that are lacking, it could be that some of those skills need to be sort of pulled out of the task analysis and taught separately. Sometimes there are fine motor issues. I mean, there's many different reasons why there might be breakdowns, so it's kind of hard to say specifically, but you'd need to assess it and look at that. But let's assume for a moment that that's not the case. Let's assume that they actually have the skills. Then you would need to possibly use some sort of a motivation system or something to get them to engage in the skills, right? Until we can hopefully maybe teach them some perspective taking and have them understand a little bit about why it might be so important, for example, to shower each day, or something like that. But in terms of actually teaching the skills, using the visual systems, task analyzing for sure, visual schedules can be incredibly helpful. We've even put visual schedules inside showers to help individuals, and video modeling actually has been really helpful as well. We actually videotape whatever the hygiene sequence is and then have the person actually watch that and follow along and continue to do that as you fade the prompt out, which would be the video.
So we've had a few people ask about the research articles that you shared in the presentation. Mm-hmm. Are those free access, or?
Yeah, I believe if you just go to Google Scholar, you should be able to access them easily.
Great.
Yeah,
okay.
They're pretty well-known articles, so they're usually available for free.
Okay. And then, do you have any examples about IEP objectives or specific lessons that you could recommend for leisure skills?
So what I would say about leisure skills, I mean, there are, there's various, curriculums, and people are always task analyzing skills. But the truth is, what I really feel about leisure skills is that it has to be preferred. It has to be enjoyable. So I see this even from a young age. So I have young children, even in early intervention, I've seen this, where people, an early intervention teacher will come in to teach a child some some play. And they'll have a list of things that they're going to teach, and it's probably based on, just early childhood, and these are some things that young kids play with. It's also probably based on what's in their bag. And so they'll teach them to do the stacking blocks and the puzzle and, all these various kinds of things. And what I find a lot, and what I have seen, is that the children don't play. They don't play with those things. So even after they're taught and even after it's mastered and checked on the sheet that it's mastered, I don't see the children ever sort of touching and engaging with those particular materials, or rarely, not many of them. And so what I have done is I've actually created a data sheet that helps people to look and see, well, now that you've taught this and it's mastered, do they engage in that independently? Do they choose it? Is there any form of preference that we're actually seeing here? And so if you're seeing that at age 2 and 3, you can imagine that that would be very much the same as we become adults. So what I find is that we try to sometimes sort of force particular leisure skills upon the individuals that we work with, and I think that the absolute most important thing that we can do is to really do assessments and try to find out what they prefer. So we have one particular individual that I work with here that we just met the other day, and we were talking about the topic of leisure skills, and he happens to be a runner, as I mentioned before. I showed you him before. He runs marathons. And one of the things that we talked about for leisure skills was maybe we could have him look at magazines. That could be like a nice leisure skill, just to flip through a magazine and look at the pictures and things like that. And we talked about having him look at sports-related magazines because he enjoys running. So that might be something that he might be more interested in. He's also interested in music. So we looked at some apps that were specific to, music and those kinds of things. So I would like to be able to say, like, just use this curriculum and it's easy, but there's no such thing as that. It doesn't really work, unfortunately, that way. But I really think that the assessment part up front and really finding those motivations is what's going to absolutely make the difference. And think about it for yourself. If you really enjoy doing something, that's what you spend your time doing. And if you don't, you're not going to choose it. So I think that that's the crucial key here. In terms of teaching the leisure skills, the same teaching methods that we talked about. Task analyzing the skill, using visuals in terms of pictures and picture schedules, using video modeling. I mean, those are all typically effective for teaching leisure skills, just as they would for many of the other task analyzed kinds of skills that we might think of. But I will guarantee you that if it's not a preferred activity, that they will not engage in it after we've spent all that time teaching it. So we have to, but we have to be also continually exposing them to new things. We can't just say, well, they only like music, so everything has to be music. They can like music, and that's great. We can try to expose them to art. We can try to expose them to fitness. We can try to expose them to computers, right? And we may find something new, and that's great too. So we always have to be looking for new activities and new leisure skills as well, which will be helpful.
Okay, I think we just have time for one last question, and this is, are there preference or choice assessments in place for this population?
So there are preference assessments, specific preference assessments that do exist. There are preference assessments that are typically used to find reinforcers, things that students might be motivated to work towards. But I have used those preference assessments to be able to assess in younger children play activities and in older children some leisure kinds of activities as well. So kind of taking that sort of structure and then using it in that way, and that's been really effective. But I'm not sure if they mean choice more specifically to vocational, in which case it would go more to the example that I showed where you would be giving, like they call them a paired stimulus or a forced choice, meaning like, would you like to do this or this? So that's one example where that could be used for some vocational preference. And there are some other vocational preferences out there. There's one called the YES assessment, and we've used that for our students. It actually has video clips, which we find to be helpful. It's a lot more visual, lets them actually see the jobs. So there are some assessments like that. There are various other assessments that are more, I'm going to say, paper-based, which are sometimes helpful for us in terms of planning and preparing. Some of the more in-person, in vivo kinds of assessments that we like to do, as I mentioned earlier, where we might ask them some questions but then do some integrity checks and that sort of thing. Because I think that we really want to make sure that we're getting the answer and that it's not just, that we're asking a question and they're kind of just throwing an answer at us, but it's not truly their choice. So we want to make sure that we're really hearing from them.
All right, so that's all the time that we have for today, but we want to thank you so much. This was very informative, and we really appreciate you answering questions.